Dave Olson had the highest ranked question, and it's a doozy. And he basically said, how would you go about hardening our power grid and associated infrastructure against EMP, which is electromagnetic pulse? So this is the how would you solve our problems, Bill, if you had unlimited time and money issue. I think, Dave, what I'd start off by doing is I would change the overall design idea of a grid completely going forward. I certainly wouldn't sink large amounts of money into this going backwards. I'll get to the hardening thing in a minute, but I would say going forward, we need to stop thinking about big power grids. I think we need to think really small. I did an afterburner about that called Think Small. I would definitely concentrate more on much smaller, much more local systems, because I'd have everything as self-contained as I could. I'd personally love to have my own thorium reactor in the backyard. I think a thorium reactor in the backyard would be just grand. Having my own power would make me very, 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 very happy. So that's the first thing I would do, is I would basically try to get the power systems as decentralized as we possibly can. Keep them small and keep them local, and use gas, use whatever we had available. And that's just my sort of starting position, is this, try to get away from this idea of these enormous power utilities with single points of failure and all this other stuff. But look, the way you go around hardening the power grid and infrastructure against EMP is the way you go around hardening it against anything. You have to spend a great deal of money on that. One of the things I would do, Dave, and I only found out about this recently from Frank Gaffney, who's done a tremendous amount of work on the grid and EMP. One of the little things I found out is that, you don't have to have a terrorist attack on a nuclear power station, that these switching stations, transformers, relay stations, are very vulnerable. There was a terrorist attack in Northern California where men with rifles shot up a transformer station, took out all of the cooling mechanisms, cut something like 6 out of the 7 communication systems, thought they cut them all, left one open, then they were able to power down these things. But one of the many things that I learned to my horror about the system is that these giant transformer power stations are, in fact, unique. In other words, it's not like it's a module. It's not like even a locomotive, right? They're making thousands of these diesel-electric locomotives. If you have a locomotive runs off a bridge or a locomotive fails, you put another locomotive on there, and the track widths are the same, and it runs on the same fuel, and it's more or less the same size, and the hitch is the same size. These transformers are about the size and weight of locomotives, some of these switching stations, and they're all unique. They're individually built for that power station, and we don't have big old stocks of them on the shelves. So one of the first things I would do would be to standardize the grid. I'd make sure that it was standardized, and I'd have some parts in reserve. Because as it turns out, if some of this stuff gets cooked, you're out of town for a long, long time. And then, frankly, the hardening process is like any other kind of systematic repair where you are trying to change an incredibly complex system. If you think about the electrical grid in the United States of America, you are maybe talking about the most complex structure on Earth when you get right down to the individual sockets in everybody's houses. It is, in fact, the nervous system of the country. It's the nervous system. And if you looked at the United States as a body, as a physical body, this would be the nervous system down to the individual neurons. So if you had to replace every neuron in the body, I think what you would do is you would start with the most critical stuff. So first thing you do is you harden by applying insulation, or going from whatever kind of control mechanisms go from electronic to optical, because you can't EMP out an optical switching system. So I'd get the control and data systems switched before I get the power system switched, so that we could stay with fiber optics, which obviously are faster. They use less energy. They're immune to EMP. So I'd start switching the communication systems to fiber as fast as I possibly could. That's going to be great because, number one, it means it's not subject to EMP. It's not subject to solar flares. I'd go to fiber optics for all the communication systems first. Second thing I would do is I would start working on hardening up the actual power, which does have to be delivered by copper wires, which is susceptible to EMP. But as I was standardizing the transformers and making everything smaller, I would be concentrating on the power conduits to the places that needed it first. So it's really just kind of common sense, isn't it? In other words, I'd harden the power plant, and then I would harden the main lines out of the power plant to the hospital, the police station, and the fire station. Those would be the first things that I would protect against EMP attack or solar flare attack or something like that. And then slowly I'd work my way out to various other buildings and make sure that everything new coming online, every new structure had to have hardened electrical systems so that you're not having to replace stuff in the future. Yeah, this would add cost. There's no question it would add cost, and people would kick about the cost a little bit. But it is the kind of thing that we have to understand. One of the things that's so annoying to me is this idea that every time I take off my shoes and belt, although I have to say I don't have to do that anymore since I'm TSA pre-approved, not to brag or anything, but for a guy who travels all the time, that is worth the investment. Is this idea that this next attack is going to come the way the last attack came, and it's not. It's going to be different. It's going to be a cyber attack or an EMP attack or something like that. So communication systems first, critical power mains second, everything new comes in hardened third, standardization of the parts so that you can literally have shelves full of these giant transformers, and if one of them gets taken out by a terrorist attack or whatever, you just pull one off the shelf and get it there, and so on. And generally speaking, make everything smaller. Make electricity as homegrown as possible. I think we often get mocked for mocking the greens, and I mock the greens all the time because I don't think the greens are about being green. I think they're about being red. But with that said, you're kind of nuts not to take advantage of the free energy from the sun, even if it's just things like preheating your hot water. These things only make sense if they make financial sense, if they make economic sense. So I would basically say, if you can afford a solar water heater, great. It'll save you money over the long run. And if you can afford solar cells to take some of the load off of your electrical system, great. Do all of that. But ultimately, for me, the world that I'd really like to see, I know we'll never get there. I'm not that naive. But what would be an ideal world would be a world where every house generated its own power. And if that's not feasible, and it's not, then a world where neighborhoods generated what power the houses couldn't generate. Make it small, make it local. And then the final thing I would do, if you want to talk about a practical solution, is one of the things that Frank Gaffney talks about with this issue is there's kind of this back and forth of guilt and blame between the government and the utilities. And it works basically like this. People start howling about, we need to harden these systems so that in case of a solar flare or a EMP attack, we don't lose the power. It's going to cost a lot of money. So the government says that's the job of the power utilities. The power utilities say, no, that's the job of the government. The government says, well, we can't do it without raising taxes. The power company says, well, we can't do it without raising rates. And so it doesn't get done. And I think maybe the way to do it would be to shame the smallest of these companies into saying, look, there's that line from Heaven Can Wait where Warren Beatty inhabits the body of a businessman, and it's something about tuna, and it's something about how there are people protesting tuna fishing, and Warren says, well, ask people if they'd pay another nickel to save a fish that thinks, and I think most people would. Just take the case to them, and I think if you take the case to them, then they'll probably get on board with you. But it's important, and I think if we had an actual leader who said, folks, here's the problem. The reason nobody takes it seriously is because it hasn't happened yet. And nobody took the foam coming off of the shuttle seriously until it ruined the Columbia's day, and no one took the burn-throughs on the SRBs until Challenger seriously until it burned through on the Challenger, and so on. So let's just understand that while this hasn't happened yet, if it does happen, it's the end of civilization as we know it. If the power grid of the country goes out and is not back for 6 months or a year, refrigeration goes, water purification goes, water pumping goes, food distribution goes, it's not pretty. So make the case, Mr. President, and then say how all of us together as Americans are going to share the burden. That's how I do it. Yeah, and as a Deidre Malcolm says, a liquid fluoride thorium reactor on every block. That's my motto. I couldn't agree more. Put it on a bumper sticker and I will have it. Fluoride thorium reactor on every block. That's the answer. Moving on.